Movie buff specialist Phil and John are back with the 22nd episode in our favorite 100 movies of all time. We are counting down from 100 to 1, and today we are talking number 79, which for John is The Others, and for me is The Return of the King. But instead of The Return of the King, since it's higher on John's list, we're going to be talking Three Colors Red. The final installment in a trilogy that I find to be epic, though not quite of the scale as the Lord of the Rings. So I figured it would be fun to break down another third film that is widely regarded as one of the great foreign international films, whatever you want to call it, of all time, and talk about how that one closes out a series. Because obviously we all know how Return of the King was able to close out the series numerous times, some would argue, in the Lord of the Rings trilogy, but different kind of thing going on here because we got a horror in The Others, and we have a French, or not a French, it's a Polish, French, Swiss co-production that was not nominated for Best Foreign Language Film during 1994, despite being nominated for director, cinematography, and screenplay, because it was not Swiss enough for the Swiss to nominate it for Best Foreign Language Film. Interesting. Fun facts. But that's Three Colors Red, a movie about communication, which I guess The Others is kind of about too, when you really break it down in that way, huh, John?
Yeah, I mean, when you think about it, it's just about communicating and reflecting on oneself.
Yeah, one's life, if you will.
Yeah, exactly.
But let's start off with Three Colors Red. I'm assuming more people have seen The Others, so let's save The Others for last here. Now, we did talk about this many weeks ago to let it be known that this was going to end up being the third in a trilogy. And if you haven't seen the trilogy, sit down, watch the entire trilogy because it's worth it. John, I know you had never seen the trilogy. I hadn't seen the trilogy since about 2011, so it was nice to sit down and rewatch it for me. Did you end up watching the entire trilogy?
I did, in fact, end up watching it all.
Good. Did you ever feel nervous at any point that you were like, oh, crap, I'm only going to get through blue and white and not get through red? Because I had that panic this week.
No, I didn't. Okay, that's not 100% true. There was definitely a point. We're in like the biggest heat wave ever in the Pacific Northwest right now. And I was very worried my power was going to cut out. I wasn't going to be able to finish it. But other than that, no, because they're such compelling films that you just want to finish watching them.
Yeah, they're easily digestible in terms of a length. It might not be easily digestible in terms of themes and all of that, but in terms of length, they're there. They're 90 minutes, 95 minutes. It's all they are. And yeah, John is about 30 degrees warmer than Florida is. Just throwing that out there. He is in the Pacific Northwest. I'm not in Florida right now, but in Florida, it is 30 degrees cooler than it is in the Pacific Northwest right now. That's not how things should be going on June 28th. All right. Anyway, this was my first time revisiting Red. I wanted to put Red in here once I had The Return of the King, and I realized that you had The Return of the King a little bit higher, and I was going to get to pick a movie to kind of throw in here. I've been wanting to rewatch the Three Colors trilogy for a really long time because it's so good, and I just kind of forgot about it. And I watched it in 2011. I was 19 years old, around there. I definitely understood it, but didn't understand it the way that I do today when I sit down and I watch this trilogy. So it was nice to be able to watch it again. I'd really been meaning to rewatch Red before I made my top 100 list and was kind of bummed that I didn't. And Red is one of those movies that's going to be right on the cusp of making it in once I kind of figure out where I want to go with all of this. But really happy to sit down and watch this again. And the whole trilogy, I think, is fantastic. I know a lot of people will say, I actually saw your review for White. You loved White, but I know a lot of people will put White as the weakest of the trilogy. And like, because they're calling it the weakest of the trilogy, they feel the need to like call it a 3-star movie or a 3.5-star movie or whatever. In my opinion, these are all 4-star movies. This is a perfect trilogy, much like I feel like the Lord of the Rings trilogy is, as all three of the movies are on my top 100. I think it's a perfect trilogy. They all just bring different things to the table. And to sit here and be like, well, that one's worse, therefore it deserves a lower rating, I just don't buy it. But to me, after rewatching all of them, I do still believe that Red is the masterpiece of the entire thing, because I love what Kieslowski, and I'm sorry if I'm butchering that, but Christoph, I love what he is portraying with this movie and his directorial decisions and all of that. When he sits down and he says, okay, we're going to make a movie about Irene Jacob, a model, and we're going to make it about a judge, John Louis Tridden, and I'm going to butcher his last name, so that's it. But we're going to make it about those two people. but also every time that one of them walks off screen, we're going to leave the camera behind to watch these other people have a relationship that we don't even know who these people are, but we're going to watch them have a relationship. We're going to listen in on their relationship. We're going to hear about the bowling incident, and then she's going to go bowling, and then we're going down the lane wondering, well, which one of these people is who she was bowling with? Like, is one of these people who she was listening in on? I think the direction is just incredible, and I think this movie does a really good job of making you think about impacts that you have on other people, or just all those little missed opportunity type things. How many people were you this close to having a much bigger impact on their life, or they were that much closer to having a bigger impact on yours? This movie does that in a way that Blue and White, they're not attempting to do that, but that Blue and White, I think that's what creates it as an epic above Blue and White, which are just really good for their genre, but they don't hit epic, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, this movie really takes the formula that Blue and White kind of established and really builds on it in a way to make this somehow more personal, despite the fact that Blue and White have such personal stories. This one seems much more relatable to the general public, because if you haven't gone through the tragedy of losing loved ones, or if you haven't gone through the tragedy of divorce, or, you know, the wonders of divorce, depending on your situation, I guess. But if you haven't gone through those, you can't really relate to Blue and White as much. But Red feels so innately human with the interactions in it and with the general themes of the movie that it's the one that's easier for an audience member to connect with.
Yeah, I do agree. And I think it's because at the end of the day, Red is just about human interaction. The others aren't about that. And so I was doing a lot of reading about Kieslowski in the Three Colors trilogy, and he said this movie is French because the money is French. He said if this wasn't French, the movies would have been the exact same movie, but maybe they would have been called something different. That's all he said. So everybody's always talking about, oh, it's, you know, it's blue, white, red, and it's about liberty and fraternity and about I forget what the third one is, but it's about what each color represents in the French flag. In reality, it's kind of not. Kieslowski wasn't about that. He didn't want the movies to be about that, but people have kind of adopted that because that's what they are. Yes, it looks like the French flag, but it's because that's how he released them, because they were from France, because it was funded totally by France or somewhat by Poland, but he's Polish. He's not French. So I doubt he's trying to make a love letter to France when he lived his entire life in Poland, or almost his entire life in Poland. So, but so all of that's just to say, while these movies are, you know, they do have deeper themes and all of that, Red is the one that you can get the surface level, I feel, is the most interesting. And then the deeper themes and all of that are also incredibly powerful. Blue, to me, is, everybody always says Blue is one of the most depressing movies of all time. And maybe I'm not the person to comment on this because I think Moonrise Kingdom is an unbelievably depressing movie. But I actually don't find Blue to be that depressing. Aside from the opening, that movie is very much about taking control. And that is also what White is about. And I think Red is actually about letting go of control. It's about just letting your life happen. The other movies are about being in control of everything. And if you think about it, in those other movies, they're not the ones who help the lady who can't put the bottle in the recycling. But when you let go and you let things happen to you and you let things happen around you, that's when you actually start to do the things that you find to be important, rather than what we see in Blue and White.
Well, and I mean, that's really pointed out in Red as well. There's the moment where they're talking about going to run the errands for the one woman. And it just comes up that everyone's motivations are selfish. You're not doing, and it's like, why did you save Rita? Why did you save this dog after you hit it? And it's like, is it because the dog was hurt, or is it because of the guilt you were going to have because of it? And it really does put the audience's focus on this idea that everything that motivates us is complete selfishness, because it's the way that it impacts us ourselves.
Yeah, and if she hits that dog and leaves it, obviously that does make her a bad person, and there is some sympathy for the dog, but she's also bringing the dog to the guy and saying to him, what should I do? Do you want me to take it to a vet? What do you want? And he says, whatever you want. And she doesn't know how to react to that, because what do you mean, whatever I want? And it's him kind of putting in perspective of, if I don't tell you what to do with it, are you going to figure out what to do with it? And the answer is yes. She ends up bringing it to the vet and then keeps the dog, because of course she's going to end up keeping the dog. What else would she do with it? But it does it. And I think what's good about this one is it never feels hokey. This movie has a lot of the same feels to me as Amelie does, which is, my number 4. So that's way, way up there. It has very similar feels and very similar themes, where it's like somebody, like people going out of their way to do things, or they're listening in, they're kind of going places they don't belong while also trying to figure out their own lives. And neither one of those movies do it in a way to me that feels hokey or unrealistic or over the top, like a pay it forward type thing, that cornball of a movie with Kevin Spacey and Helen Hunt. I think it's Helen Hunt, but it's just a cornball of a movie. And this movie doesn't do it in a corny way. It does it in a very straightforward, you either believe that this is what's happening or you don't. But at the end of the day, you can put yourself in the position of the judge or of the model, or you could put yourself in the position of the person who leaves the guy who just went through school, or the guy who just went through school and was left. You can put yourself in any of their positions. And I think that's what's so interesting about this, and what you had said earlier on. Unless you've gone through divorce, unless you've gone through the tragic loss of somebody close to you, you might not be able to connect with blue and white as easily and readily as you are with red.
And that's what makes this trilogy as a whole so satisfying, is that we do get these stories in blue and white, like you said, very much about taking control, going on with it. But the fact that it ends with white, with red, where your themes are looking at this idea of kind of letting go of everything, accepting what's going on around you, and just letting that be the life you're living. It really just empowers the entire trilogy as a whole. And while none of these movies are really dependent on being in a trilogy, they're, like we've already said, they're phenomenal films in their own right. And you don't need to watch blue and white to be able to enjoy red. Are there nods in white and red that reference back to the prior movies in the trilogy? Yes. Are they relevant to the plot? Not so much. But it brings all those themes together so nicely at the end of Red.
Yeah, and so the ending of Red is the only time these three movies really have anything to do with each other. There's a point in White where he's at the divorce hearing and Juliette Binoche walks in. That's really the only thing that happens there. I know Julie Delpy makes a very brief appearance in Blue, I believe, and I believe Carol might also be in it. I don't think Irene Jacob is in any of the others. No. But all of that's to say, and I don't know. I mean, I'm interested now because I forgot to look. But in White, is it the same judge or no? It's not. I don't believe it is. But anyway,
I don't think so.
But all of that's to say, the only time that these movies have anything to do with each other is really the end, or from a story perspective, not from a thematic perspective, but is the end of Red, when the ferry crashes and the people who all get off the ferry are all the people we've just watched, and then Steve Killian, a bartender, which I find hilarious. We spent time with all these other people, and then Steve Killian. Thank God. At least they can all get drunk after this, And I think even that, like ending Red with that, not ending Blue or White, or not electing to do Blue or White second. Blue and White are about taking control, and Red is about the things that are outside of your control and trying to control too much. Getting on that ferry, they didn't know that ferry was going to crash. And you still, but they survived that crash. So, somehow they survived it. And what I think is really interesting about this is, I love Crash. I love Magnolia. I love those mosaic type movies where lives crisscross and it's all that's the Tarantino thing. I mean, the Pulp Fiction posters behind me right now. I love all of those types of things. I think that's super interesting. I think it's really fascinating. But I also think that a lot of times that feels contrived, whereas in Red, it doesn't feel contrived, because by waiting until the very end to show us this, it's almost like you showed us the three lives, or the three sets of lives that were going to be important to this ferry. And it's like, you hear about plane crashes, you hear about car accidents, whatever. You'll hear about, I remember there was a kid who had survived 2 private plane crashes, within a year. Everybody else in his family died, but not him. And you wonder, what was that person's life before everything? And this movie, this trilogy does such an interesting thing of being like, okay, if we would have started off and told you all of these people were in a ferry crash, then we told you the stories, you'd be like, oh, okay, how'd they get on the ferry? How'd they get on the ferry? How'd they get on the ferry? You don't care that they got on the ferry. I don't know how Juliette Binoche got there. I don't know why Carol and Dominique are going there. I don't know how Dominique got out of jail. None of it matters. But by not telling us that they're all going to be a part of that at the beginning and not trying to interweave it and not even trying to force them all to get on the ferry, it's just so impactful at the end because it's almost like we were being told the stories that you would wonder about had you heard about this, but we were being told it in a way that, like I always say with Once Upon a Time in Hollywood and Everybody Wants Some, you don't know what's coming. And sometimes that's what makes things more interesting is you don't understand the buildup, even if we do.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially in this, like, you didn't expect this to happen at all at the end of this movie. It kind of comes out of left field, especially because, like, we have the weather report a couple of scenes earlier saying that it's going to be completely clear sailings. And then all of a sudden it's this like massive tragedy, and you can see it on the judge's face. Like there's guilt on his face because he's like, I'm the reason she's dead now. And just like that relief when he finally sees her in the news report.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, yeah, what I also find interesting is like the weather is something we can't control. Weathermen are always wrong. Like weathermen, it's the easiest job in the world. A meteorologist, you're always wrong. Like it doesn't matter. I've been told it's going to rain every day. It doesn't rain. You know, it's like you find out, and guess what? If it doesn't rain, it doesn't rain. Like if it rains, it rains. Whatever. And the weather is something people want to be in control of. Or no, should I go to the beach today? Should I go here? Like whatever. And at the end of the day, it's something that's totally out of your control. Like who knows? A thunderstorm could roll through at any time because the clouds just decide there's going to be a thunderstorm. A tornado happens, and there's nothing you can do about that coming. And I think it's kind of funny how the person who's running this weather service really doesn't know what they're talking about. Like we see that at the end, that it's kind of just like it was a hobby. It's kind of like us talking about movies or me and Alexa talking about Survivor. At the end of the day, it's more of just a hobby, and it's something that you enjoy doing, so you do it. And some people are taking it as gospel or, oh, great, this will be fine. Had he known that the weather was going to be bad, would he have told her, hey, don't take that ferry, maybe take one a different day? Maybe, but also he's the one who's been promoting this entire movie. Don't get in the way of things that you can't control. Just kind of eavesdrop, but don't go and put yourself in the middle of it, because when he does put himself in the middle of something, he ends up breaking up a relationship.
Yeah, and I think that's why it's so important that it's him who's given this advice here and like suggests her to take the ferry, because it really does help nail home that entire idea that you have to kind of just go with it. You have to take whatever is given to you and go with it. And it's really reflected when he's like discussing like his different cases that he's had in the past. And he's talking about like the people he's acquitted and the people he found guilty and everything. And how when he had that personal case that he should have not been doing, and then he found it guilty. The movie never tells you if the person was actually guilty or not. And that's because it's all about this idea of going with what has already happened and not reflecting back on it.
Yeah. And I think a lot of this, what we end up seeing in these movies and with that, a lot of this is reflective of Kieslowski's kind of beliefs and personality. It's very funny to read Kieslowski interviews about these movies. This trilogy has been dissected like crazy by cinephiles. Cinephiles love this trilogy. This is a trilogy people want to understand more. They want to know the deeper meanings. And I found this great quote from him last night because I was just going through and I was reading about it. And his quote was, and let me pull this up, but it was regarding the lady with the recycling. They said, what is the symbolism of this? People have dissected. Oh, Juliette Binoche was just too bothered and whatever. And Carol loves that he's better than everybody. And, good. There's somebody who's worse off than me. And then you have her at the end of Red being like, oh, well, because I was with the old person. Here's Kieslowski's response. All I want to do is remind us that someday we might be too old to get a bottle into a recycling bin. It's so on the nose But I think it's also part of the theme of these, which is don't overthink this stuff. Like, just do it. Just let it happen, or just be a part of it. Be in those moments. Kieslowski, I haven't seen much of his other work, but The Dual Life of Veronique and Decalogue are two of his other really highly regarded movies. And Decalogue is kind of like a 10-part series. But it's all kind of just about the human connection and the human interactions and what it is that makes us human. Why does Carol need Dominique so bad that he goes through this entire revenge plot, this whole ridiculous thing, and it works? And it's like the opposite of how most people would try to get somebody back. But why does he go through that entire thing of pretty much becoming a low-level gangster? Why does Juliette Binoche, feel the need to start sleeping with Olivier and all of that? Like, what is the purpose of all of this? And I think, like, at the end of the day, is like, because that's just what people do. Like, that's like, eventually this is what happens to some of us, and sometimes it doesn't happen. But I think he's very Cohen-y, or the Coen brothers kind of adopted what he would do, where it's like, yeah, it means whatever the hell you want it to mean. I don't really care. Like, this is what I like. It's what it is, and then it's whatever else you feel like it needs to be. And Red is fascinating to me with the relationship and all of that, and this judge who is clearly contending with so much, but we don't know what it is that he's contending with.
Yeah, and a lot of it comes down from the time where Valentine first realizes he's spying on people. And then he just straight up says, yeah, it's that house over there. Go tell him right now. And like, fully knowing that she's not going to be able to because of her like moral convictions of the situation. It's just fascinating how in depth this looks at the human condition without having to like throw it in your face. That is looking at the human condition.
Well, because really, there's so many situations that should be so simple, and they end up not being simple. I mean, you see somebody committing a wrong, you would normally say, okay, I should correct that person and make it a right. I should tell them where they're wrong and all that. But then you start to think, okay, how is this person going to react? Are they going to shoot me? Are they going to kill him? I guess in Canada, maybe not shoot, but stab. I don't know. But, down here, I just think of shootings. What is this person going to do? What is their reaction going to be? And for her, it wasn't even so much what is this guy's reaction going to be when I out him as gay to his wife. It was the daughter on the phone. And it's this whole idea of, so many people don't say something or don't do something a lot of the time because they feel it's not their business. What I find interesting is that we just lived through this time of COVID where everything was everybody's business. If you didn't wear a mask, you were this. If you did wear a mask, you were this. If you didn't wash your hands, you were this. Everybody was in everybody's business, worrying about every little thing. But the general human condition is, they always tell you in psychology classes, if there's a murder or somebody hears somebody scream rape in an apartment complex, nobody will call the cops. Because they're assuming somebody else will call the cops, and they don't want to be the one who has to deal with it. And that's the really messed up part about a lot of this stuff. And I think that's what this movie is proving in that moment of, okay, I'm going to go tell them. But then it's like, well, is it really my place to blow up this guy's entire life? And not only that, blow up his family's entire life, ruin his daughter's life and ruin his wife's life, even more so than just ruining his life.
Yeah. And I mean, that is a large just portion of Valentine's character too, because a lot of the time what we see her doing is just meddling in people's lives the entire time, because there's this whole subplot with her brother Mark and the fact that her father isn't his father, but she wants him to go spend time with their lonely mother. And he does, but like, he's only there for 3 days because that's all he can handle, because Valentine's never really thinking of more than one person at a time. And that's kind of where the issue comes with Valentine. She's so focused on a single person's reaction to something that she doesn't think of the larger spread impact of everything, which is what this movie's really trying to show you, is that while it might make sense to do something for a single person, there are ramifications that ripple through everyone else connected to that person.
Yeah. And I love at the end when August, and that's his name, I believe it's August or August, something like that. But it's August and Valentine standing next to each other, getting off the boat. they've lived a block away from each other the whole time and never known.
Mm-hmm.
And it's one of those you would almost, when they talk, because I think this movie's also giving the illusion of hope for all of these characters. We see that Carol and Dominique have gotten closer again, or perhaps this is before they actually go through that. Now, I don't think that, but there has been that argument out there that this is actually earlier in the relationship and that we just didn't hear about it. But I don't think that works because of Juliette Binoche walking into the courtroom. I think that's the one thing that stops that from really being true. But anyway, all of that being said, it's giving hope for all of these characters. They're all moving to do something with their lives. They were all on this ferry for a reason. What is that reason? And so I think it's hopeful at the end when we see the two of them together in one of the great ending shots, I would argue, in the history of film, when it's the exact image that had been up on the billboard the entire time, except now it's her getting off of this and it's like art matching reality and all that fun stuff. I love that, but it's giving the hope that they're going to end up figuring this out. Maybe they'll get together because obviously her and Michelle, it's not going to work out. And August and his girlfriend or whatever she was, that's not going to work out. So maybe now the two of them will be able to get together, and what brought them together, still this old man, this old judge is what brought them together. Because if you really think about it, he's the most integral part of that relationship. He got her on the ferry and he got the other person to break up. So it's giving so much hope at the end of this movie. And, for a movie for a trilogy that starts off with a car accident and is somber throughout the entire first movie. And then the entire second movie is like, a gangster movie or whatever you want to call it, a comedy gangster. I don't know what you want to call that movie. It's just so bizarre. But for it to end on a hopeful note is always a good thing.
No, absolutely. And to your point about the people theorizing that this happens before White, it's not possible. They specifically mention Carol as a Polish businessman.
Oh, that's right. They do mention him as a Polish businessman. That's a good point. All right. No more forums for me.
Yeah. No more of these crazy conspiracy theories. But yeah, and that's what the beauty of this entire trilogy is that despite the fact that it does start very, very depressing, like an accident right away, and you're just seeing Julie's grief throughout all of Blue, and you're seeing Carol's grief and response to it throughout White. And even in Red, we kind of see this like hopelessness and loneliness within Valentine the entire time. And it just ends on this hopeful note. And it really does kind of go to show that when we let the past control everything that's going on with us, it can really make things difficult for us. But when we learn to kind of roll with what's going on around us and accept the things that have shaped us into who we are, it really does provide us with a lot more opportunity.
Yeah, and I don't think it's ever said in the movie, like, let go of your past, or in the trilogy. I don't think that's ever said, but it's so heavily implied. And that's why I said, even like for Blue, I feel like that's a hopeful movie. Like that movie gets more and more positive as the movie goes on. And I'm happy that this trilogy was able to pick up so much steam at the time, because as we were talking about, I believe it was just last week we were talking about Burnt by the Sun. That's crazy. But we were talking about that and how Roger Ebert was very angry that Burnt by the Sun won Best Foreign Language Film. And I told you the whole controversy around it. Red came out the same year and wasn't able to be nominated. And I think that's one of the stupidest things about the Academy Awards is the way they handle international film, because it can only be one movie from each country and blah, blah. And it's like, how many great international movies weren't nominated? The Cranes Are Flying and this, and there's so many. I mean, none of this trilogy was nominated for Best Foreign Language Film, even though it was nominated for director, screenplay, and cinematography. How is it not so? But it's not even in the running, And Burnt by the Sun never had a chance to be nominated for any of those things because nobody had ever heard of any of the people who were involved in it. So it's just funny how that works. But all that's to say, 1994 was a great year for movies, and with Forrest Gump and Pulp Fiction and Quiz Show and The Shawshank Redemption, obviously. And you have all those great movies, and we've talked about 3 movies from that year so far. And the 3 movies we talked about are 3 foreign language movies: Burnt by the Sun, Queen Margot, and Red. And guess what? 2 of them weren't nominated for Best Foreign Language Film. Your guess is as good as mine.
Yeah, it's really wild how the Academy just views film in general when it comes to foreign films. There's a lot of people get lost in American cinema and think that it's the only cinema out there. But one thing that we really are exploring with our top 100s is the fact that there is a lot of foreign cinema out there that's well worth watching. Mm-hmm. And just because it doesn't get nominated for something doesn't mean it's not a phenomenal film.
Yeah, and it's just worth digging it up. I mean, because that's not always the easiest thing to do, but there's some gems to dig up. And I mean, luckily my one friend who he did his top 100 at the same time I did mine, he had like Queen Margot on his list. He has a lot of foreign movies that aren't nominated. You know, what was the Water Lilies, Pauline at the Beach? Like, he has a lot of movies on there that weren't nominated for this. And I wonder, like, okay, he found that because I know he's always on the Criterion Collection and all these different. He's on all these different sites. He's like a DVD hound. Yeah. He loves to hoard those. But the people who do love foreign movies. I love foreign movies. I always did. Amelie, The Secret in Their Eyes. I mean, these are movies that I was watching when I was 15, 16, 17 years old. You know, I Loved You So Long. It's another great one. And you start going through all of these movies, and then it's like, how do you find these older ones? And how do you open this up? Because now, as sad as this is, 1994 is 27 years ago. How do you get people interested in the Three Colors trilogy? Because it's not an easy sell, but how do people hear about it now, 27 years later? Because I haven't heard anybody talk about the Three Colors trilogy probably since about 2006, 2007. And I think all three of the movies have now dropped off the IMDb top 250. And without that happening, if you're a new film person, you're on Rotten Tomatoes or IMDb, and that's your main thing as a 14, 15-year-old, like it was when I was a 14, 15-year-old, now these movies have suddenly just fallen out of reach. They might be number 251 on IMDb, but you're not going to see that.
Yeah, and I mean, that's where, without tooting our own horn, that's where things like this are really important when it comes to cinephiles and helping cinephiles find films like this. That's how I found a lot of the films in my top 100, was me just being interested in film, watching other content creators' film reviews or like top 10 lists of specific genres and things like that. And that's how I find some of the films to look. And yeah, it involves a lot more effort than just like looking at the Rotten Tomatoes and IMDb list. But you find so much more out of that because you do get to explore these other foreign countries and these other genres that are not popularized and don't get a lot of attention from the general public.
Yeah. No, it's absolutely true. And I wish, again, not tooting our own horn, but I wish somebody would have done this while I was growing up, because I could have used a podcast like this to listen to, because there'd be movies that I would watch and then nobody had seen them. So what good was that going to do me? Anyway, all of that being said, Red actually is 244 on IMDb's top 250 at the time of recording this. So it is still on there. So people might still hear about them. But that's it. That's what I got for that. You have anything else you want to say about Red before we move on?
I think we really need to acknowledge the use of color palette that Kieslowski uses in the trilogy, and the fact that as we get through it, it does become more muted. The reds aren't as prevalent in Red as the blues were in Blue. I think that's also very interesting when you connect it to the themes that you're told at the very beginning of the movie that the title of the movie is this color. And then all throughout Blue, we have blue everywhere. All throughout White, we have white everywhere. But in Red, we're a lot darker reds. We're a lot less saturated when it comes to the color palette. And it really does kind of feel like that idea of moving on from the rest of the trilogy and on with life and appreciating it.
Yeah, it gets easier to digest as it goes on. The blue is just it's all over because she's just miserable, and the whites are, that's a color that you might not notice as much anyway. And then, the reds, it's more of background in Red. It's not so much right in the beginning. But Blue and White are two movies that we could dissect thoroughly too and do two whole other podcasts on. Red just happened to be the one I chose because it was the third in the trilogy, as was The Return of the King. But yes, these are movies that should be studied. And what makes me laugh is I think I watched one clip of Blue in my years of film school while we watched mountains and mountains of older foreign film, and which is fine. But just because it's old doesn't mean it's better. And sometimes it's time to kind of like start, instead of having us sit down and watch, a foreign movie from 1940, like instead of the Bicycle Thieves, I think people might be a little bit more receptive to the Three Colors trilogy at this point, because, Bicycle Thieves is 80 years old at this point. Going to have a different type of reaction than you are to something that's maybe newer. And that's not always to say that old is worse. It's just you can show a lot of the same things with things that are new.
Absolutely.
That's what I got. All right. John, what was the best movie you watched this week? And if it was one of the Three Color trilogy other than Red, I guess that counts, right?
Yeah, but I mean, we've talked about those a lot already. And yeah, it was White and other than Red. But the best non-Three Colors movie I watched this week, I watched Black Sunday last night, the Mario Bava film. What a fantastic horror film that's just so evocative of the 1930s style that Bava just brings it up into the 60s and really kickstarts that giallo genre. It's a phenomenal film. If you haven't watched it and haven't jumped into giallo yet, it's one of the greatest eras of horror movies.
I have not seen Black Sunday, so that is something that I will definitely check out.
And what about you, Phil? What was your best movie this week?
So I actually just watched this right before this, but I watched The Swimmer with Burt Lancaster. It was amazing. Like in every aspect of it, it feels dreamlike, and it's but it's one of the most depressing movies I've ever seen in my entire life. And you all know that I love depressing. And yes, I gave it 4.5 stars, meaning keep this in mind for the next time I do a top 100 list, because I love depressing. But oh my God, is this one depressing? It is brutal, and it is just about a guy. I had never heard of it. Again, this was on my friend's top 100 list, so I checked it out and I put it on my list so I could watch all his top 100. And some are better than others. But so I sat down and I watched this one today. All I knew about it was that it was about a guy who decides to swim home through his neighbor's pools. And you're like, well, how does that work? Just watch the movie. It is so brutal. There's a sense of impending dread from the first moment that Burt Lancaster shows up on screen in just his skin tight. I guess it was a bathing suit at the time, but it sure looks like boxer briefs to me. From the moment he shows up on screen and only that until the last shot of the movie, devastating. Just phenomenal in all aspects. Little known, but came out in 1968. So 1968 just keeps growing on me as one of the best years of all time, with Planet of the Apes and 2001 and Rosemary's Baby, Once Upon a Time in the West, and now The Swimmer. It's a pretty damn good top 5. Good job, 1968. And guess what? None of those movies won Best Picture. So,
of course not.
Hey, what's going on here, kids? All right. Let's go on to John's number 79, The Others, a horror movie from 2001 with Nicole Kidman. And I was very excited watching it this time because I didn't realize the first time. Christopher Eccleston. Hello, my friend. How are you? One of the great characters in TV history, and I don't care what anybody says to me, from The Leftovers. Christopher Eccleston. John, why the Others? And did you realize Christopher Eccleston was in it the last time you watched it?
Oh, I definitely did not realize Christopher Eccleston was in it, and I watched it this time. I was like, oh, it's Christopher Eccleston. This is fantastic. But when it comes down to The Others is really the first horror movie I ever really watched as a kid. I remember watching it just after it came out in 2001. My best friend and I would rent a horror movie every Tuesday night, and we would watch it. And The Others was the first one. And I remembered at the time it was spooky and everything. But as time's gone on, in the 20 years since this movie came out, I've just grown to appreciate it so much more for what it is. It is arguably the greatest haunted house movie ever made. And I think the haunted house genre of horror movies, when told correctly, is phenomenal. I mean, there's one that surpasses it, that everyone knows surpasses it, in The Shining, which is technically a haunted house movie. But other than that, this hits all the notes of the classics, like The Haunting and The Innocents. And it just does it in such a creative way where you're not really sure where the movie's going. And when you finally do get to the conclusion of this movie and the twist is revealed, it's a shocker. Even if you know it's coming, because you're looking for the hints throughout the entire time. But it is executed so well. It's just an instant classic to me.
Yeah, so this was the first time I'd watched this in a long time. Michelle Fairley makes a guest appearance in this movie, which was hilarious because it's well before her days as Catelyn Stark. Fiona Flanagan, before she was in Lost, was in this. So a lot of really like interesting casting here. Or people that now further down the line, we've actually seen them grow, mostly in TV settings. But Nicole Kidman, this was the same year as Moulin Rouge. This was coming off of Eyes Wide Shut. This was right before The Hours. I mean, Nicole Kidman was on an absolute heater in the late 90s, early 2000s. She was just top notch. And so I hadn't seen this in a really long time. I think there's movies that do it better, such as J.A. Bayona's The Orphanage. I really love that movie. I think that's a really good one for this genre. But what I appreciate about what the others did in 2001, and it's kind of why I appreciate so much what the Blair Witch Project did in 1999. We were in an era of crude comedies and horror movies that were jump scares. That's the era that we had gotten to. We had gotten past the point of the Silence of the Lambs and like movies of the 70s and the late 60s, like that type of horror. We had moved away from that. And now we were getting to the point of people want jump scares and all that. The Others is such an old school horror movie. Mm-hmm. It takes its time. It's a slow burn. Some people might call it boring. Some people might call it really boring, and that's fine. The Orphanage, one of the biggest complaints about it was that it was boring, and I couldn't disagree more. But it takes its time. And nowadays people are kind of impatient when it comes to horror. You got to scare them right from the first shot of the movie. But I love that everything is there that you need to know. Why did these three show up on that day, and why did everybody else disappear without a trace? They didn't disappear without a trace. Nicole Kidman and her kids disappeared without a trace because they died. And when that twist happens, it does catch you off guard, but then it almost makes you wonder now, if you are seeing that movie for the first time in 2021, do you like The Others that much, or do we appreciate it so much more because it came out when we were 9, 10 years old, whatever it was? And so we're able to sit down and say, wow, that was like one of the first times it did this. And now every movie has tried to pull off some sort of twist, because at the end of the day, this is a very simple movie. It is a haunted house movie told from the opposite perspective. That is all it is.
Yeah. But I think what it comes down to, and why I think this one holds up so well, you have to remember this was released in 2001. That is 2 years after 1999, when The Sixth Sense pulled the exact same twist.
That's true. That's a good point.
And I was thinking about this while I was rewatching. After I rewatched it, it was like, and not many people talk about The Others. The haunted house genre has really gone to the wayside, and a lot of that did happen because if you look at there was an attempt to revitalize the haunted house genre before this movie came out. You had the House on Haunted Hill remake and the Haunting remake, both of which were atrocious.
Yeah.
And so really people weren't really looking for haunted house movies, and especially one like this, which is so evocative of those ones from the 60s. And then again, it also has this twist that's the exact same as one of the most successful twists ever in cinema history. And people don't talk about The Others anymore. And I think it just kind of got overlooked because of the combination of those two things. When I first saw The Others, even looking back as a 9-year-old, I knew the twist at the end of The Sixth Sense long before seeing that movie, because everyone talked about it. I didn't know the twist in The Others before I actually sat down and watched it.
That's such a great point, because I didn't even think about the gravity of the fact that this came out 2 years after The Sixth Sense and the balls it took to make this movie, because everybody could have called this a ripoff of The Sixth Sense because you're doing the same twist. I didn't even think about that. And I think that makes it even more impressive. Yeah, it's 20 years later, but I think if you can put it in that context, I think that makes it even more impressive, because you were pulling the wool over people's eyes who had just seen all of this happen and they still didn't really see it coming. I'm sure there were some, but this is a really well hidden twist, and you don't really start to pick up on it until they're hiding the graves, and then you start saying to yourself, okay. But the whole time, what you really think is that Fiona Flanagan and the other two are the ones who are dead, and that somehow they're just there and they're kind of terrorizing the family. But that's a really good point that I hadn't thought about when I was watching it, when I was preparing for this, that The Sixth Sense had happened right before. And I will say this, and I don't know if The Sixth Sense is on your list, is it?
No.
Okay. I think this movie holds up a lot better than The Sixth Sense, because I think The Others is a more interesting story. It's a more interesting, I think the filmmaking is more interesting than The Sixth Sense. The Sixth Sense, without the twist ending, in my opinion, really isn't that good of a movie. And the last time I watched it about 3 years ago. I was incredibly disappointed in The Sixth Sense, because to me, it just felt like okay. The stuff with the girl with the cleaner or whatever, that was really crazy. But other than the twist, it felt basic to me, and it didn't grasp me. But The Others, I actually felt like was so well done with the set design and the costuming and those not cheap scares, like when it's I am your daughter and those types of moments, because we're sitting there going, well, what is real and what isn't? Like, what are we looking at here? I think it did a good job with that. And then, The Ring, I think, came maybe 3 years later, where it kind of amplified this whole, like, somebody's possessed my daughter or somebody's possessed whatever. And yeah, I mean, after that, I don't know if there was a really, I mean, The Descent is different, but I don't know if there was like a really great mainstream horror movie made for close to like 10 years after that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's really what's so interesting about this movie, especially because on a rewatch, it's not a very scary movie at all.
Mm-mm.
They don't show you anything in this movie. You don't get there's a lot of anticipatory scares in it, where it's like the dread of something happening.
Mm-hmm.
But really, the I am your daughter is the first time we see anything supernatural in this movie at all, and that's well over an hour into this hour and a half long movie.
Yeah, and I find like actually the scariest part of the movie to be when the three are walking across the field. I think that's one of the coolest shots, when they're walking across the field and the one girl is standing at the gravestone and the kid's standing in between, and it's like, come on. So here's my fun story for you, John. Okay, you ready? This is my other story, and I want everybody to understand this. So it came out in 2001 in the summer. We went and saw this in the summer in New Jersey. I'm 9 years old. Go to the movie theater, AMC, packed. It was before stadium seating. This was all the rows just full, packed. It was a full show. We go to this movie. The moment when they say to her, go and check on them upstairs, you know what I'm talking about? When the three people are outside the door and we just had them come across. We have all this stuff going on. You hear the noises. Go check on them upstairs. The power went out in the entire movie theater.
Oh.
The power goes out. Everybody in the theater is sitting there going, wow, no. There was such a bad thunderstorm, they couldn't get the power to come back on. They gave everybody refunded tickets so we could all come back and watch it again. We had 5 minutes left, and all we had left was what the big twist was. So we went back and actually sat down and watched the movie again. The problem was by then we had figured out what the twist was. So we had figured out like, it's probably that they're the ones who are dead, but we didn't get that absolute satisfaction of seeing how it concluded. And we had to go back and rewatch the entire movie again just to see the last 5 minutes, because the first time we saw it, she grabbed the banister to walk upstairs and the power in the entire theater went out.
Oh, that's so unfortunate.
But it also to me too is like why I remember The Others. This is a movie I will never forget because I had that type of experience with it. And so is this movie as good as I say it is? I don't know. Maybe it's not. But I had such an experience with it. And like you said, this is one of the first horror movies you really watched. When you have that kind of experience with a movie, it's going to linger longer than another movie that maybe is better. But everybody in that movie theater that day, and it was so that there had to be 200 people in that movie theater. Every single one of them remembers what that experience was like 20 years later. I guarantee it.
And while you had these endings spoiled, the nice thing about The Others is knowing the twist doesn't ruin this movie.
Doesn't.
At all. Because you're just going through it, combing, trying to find the clues to it. We talked about this with twist endings previously. The clues have to be set up beforehand for it to be a good twist. And The Others does it really well. And one of the most fascinating things that I think tells you that they are dead the entire time is that Nicole Kidman keeps referencing the German invasion.
Mm-hmm.
That never happened, everyone.
Mm-hmm.
Germans never landed on English soil.
And that's all she's talking about, is that the island became occupied.
Mm-hmm. So it's just like these little tiny things in there that hint at it. And what I really like about this movie is how it sets up the idea of the haunted house right away. Immediately. Hey, here's this foggy, isolated estate where there's conveniently only this one family and these creepy housekeepers. Oh, the kids are photosensitive, so every room has to be only lit by candlelight. Like, they're just setting it up to give you a reason for it to be this creepy ass haunted house, and it all works so well together.
Yeah. Yeah, and even like when the father comes back, you're like, why is he being so distant? Why is he being so awful? Why is all this? And what you're realizing is he's realizing this means that his wife actually did kill his kids. That's what you're realizing. And you don't realize that till the end, but that's why he's going through all of those emotions as he's laying there. And that's why he is so distant and can't get through all of that. But with setting it up that he's not there to protect, and now you have these interesting keepers coming to kind of keep track of the house, and there was no ad post and all that. What is going on here? There's a lot of layers to it that all ultimately end up paying off one way or another. And I think that's, that's not an easy thing to do, to balance. I feel like the hardest thing for horror movies is their B storyline. Every horror movie has an A storyline, and the B storyline always feels like BS. The C storyline always feels like BS. I think this movie does a really good job with its A, B, and C storylines, and having them all actually come into play in the movie, because we hear all this stuff about, oh, we need the priest to come. We need the priest to come. There's no priest in this movie. Thank God. We don't need a priest in this all the time. It's too much, so a lot of times that's what people will go to. And sorry to interrupt this regularly scheduled programming, but Stuart Arbery, thank you so much with the I don't even know what it's called, but with the $4.99, we'll take that. I guess it's the super like or something like that. But saw a triple feature of 3 colors at the Egyptian. Thought they would feel long, wrong. They flew by. Thanks for championing. Love that you were able to do that. Seeing them at the Egyptian was probably awesome. Unfortunately, now that I'm back in South Florida, I'll probably never see a movie like this in a theater again. But yeah, The Others, I think, does a very good job with all of its storylines. Every single one of them has a good payoff, and that's it's not something you see all the time.
Yeah, exactly. And what I even like more about it is a lot of the time these horror movies have like very trivial themes to them. A lot of them are based on grief and suffering and things like that, and a lot of them have the our stereotypical horror genre themes of like virginity and things like that. But The Others decides to just come straight out at you and throw out some heavy theology on you, where there's this heavy religious aspect of this movie the entire way through, and you could just see the moment Nicole Kidman's like, I don't even know anymore.
Yeah, and what I appreciate about The Others is that it has this very heavy religious aspect, but it doesn't have to go through a possession then in order for us to understand. Like, we don't have to have demonic possession. It doesn't have to be like The Omen or like The Exorcist or like all the crappy spin-offs of those movies. This is just very much about losing your faith because you don't understand why this is happening. And that is, that's not the popular thing to do these days, like, and everybody has to have an exorcism or has to have something like that. When it comes to religion, every Conjuring movie has some sort of exorcism in it, but that becomes stale. It's better I always find psychological horror to be better than like physical horror. That's just my personal taste. But I think that's why a movie like The Exorcist does work. The scariest parts of The Exorcist aren't the parts that involve the actual demonic possession. It's the fact of the psychological impact that's having on everybody who's around the demonic possession. And The Others is very much like that. It's not, what's scary isn't that there's someone in the house. What's scary is that they don't know what it is. And why are they the ones who are being chosen? Like, why were they the ones picked for this? Psychologically, that's weirder because, it could happen to anyone, or at least that's how this movie is meant to feel in the moment. All of a sudden, their place of sanctuary doesn't feel that way anymore.
Until we get 5 minutes later, and it's just like, this is our home. And you see the living people booking it out of there. And like them just being straight convicted to haunting the living daylights out of any person who decides to move into this house.
Yeah, because they want it for themselves. And you know what I thought was fun about this movie is I like all of the horror tropes, the curtains opening, the papers flying, doors not being closed. I like that a lot of the time it's the ghosts that we're watching doing it, and we're not able to see the reaction of Victor or of his parent when it's like, why is that door open now? But instead we're seeing it from the other perspective. And I think it's funny that like this movie is essentially saying that whether you're a ghost or whether you're the regular person, if you don't know, you're terrified of what's happening around you because it doesn't make sense to you. You need things to make sense. Otherwise they're scary.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's exactly why this movie is so brilliant and why it's landed in my top 100.
Yeah, so now, did this director ever really do anything else or not really?
I don't think so. I looked into this earlier this week. I should know the answer to it.
Yeah, I'd like to be able to put you on the spot for this one.
I know. Let's check here.
Alejandro Amenabar. What is it? Amenabar.
Chilean.
Yep.
Oh,
he did The Sea Inside, but that's not a horror movie, but that's pretty good. Oh, he did the original Abre Los Ojos. Okay.
Yeah, he was also a writer on Vanilla Sky.
Well, Abre Los Ojos is the original of Vanilla Sky, and then Cameron Crowe remade that movie.
Yeah.
Let's see. Yeah, so not much though.
That, not really. No, he didn't really penetrate into here, and I think I don't really recall The Others being talked about that much in 2001. And it's definitely not been talked about much since then. It really didn't have this lasting legacy that some of the horror movies around it have obtained since then.
It made a lot of money. It made a lot of money. It made $209 million. So that was big in 2001. So it did make a lot of money. I think the problem with it is 2001 is one of the most crowded years for movies ever. And I say this all the time. Lord of the Rings, first one, Amelie, Royal Tenenbaums, Black Hawk Down, In the Bedroom, Moulin Rouge, Gosford Park. You had a lot of really big directors working on really big movies. I mean, that's Robert Altman, that's Wes Anderson, that's Jean-Pierre Jeunet, that's Peter Jackson. Like, that's Ridley Scott. You have all these massive guys. Mulholland Drive was that year with David Lynch getting the nomination. So many movies came out that year that I think it's easy now. If you're just doing a quick Google of 2001 movies, 2000 movies, whatever, The Others isn't going to come up right away. It's just not. There's other movies that are more well-regarded or just more well-known at this point. But it did win 7 Goya Awards, including Best Film and Best Director. So, I mean, the Goya Awards are like the biggest thing you can do in Spain. I mean, that's pretty much the Academy Awards of Spain. That's pretty good. So it was well done, but I think that horror movies also have a harder time standing the test of time because what scares people changes so drastically from one generation to another. And while this one should work, it never produced a sequel. It didn't produce a franchise. And if you think about like Blair Witch Project, the reason people probably watched Blair Witch Project 5 years ago is because they made the new Blair Witch Project. The reason why people watch The Evil Dead again is because they made the new Evil Dead. Paranormal Activity. Like all of those movies kept producing sequels or remakes or something. Texas Chainsaw Massacres had like about 7,000 of them. So that's going to make you go back to them. The Others hasn't done that because I think The Others is a hard movie to remake because you already know what the story is. and we've already seen the genre done so many times. You don't need to make that same movie. And anytime you do remake it, everybody's gonna go, "Oh, that's the one where they're the ghosts," and then that's it. That's the horror of the movie. That's it. It's over. There's no way to remake this movie now.
Yeah, that's a really good point. The haunted house genre is so overdone at this point, I guess we could say. But we have seen kind of the revitalization with some of these Netflix series, like the Haunting series on Netflix has been revisiting some of these classic horror tropes. So maybe we will see a revitalization of this idea of how the haunted house movie should be, and people reflecting back on the others moving forward.
Yeah. Yeah, and maybe this will help. Maybe us just talking about this will get a couple people to talk about it. Came out August 2nd, 2001. So we are about a month away from the 20-year anniversary of this movie. And they're not doing any box sets for the others at their 20th anniversary, but this was a movie that caught a lot of people by surprise. And I think the fact that it was just Nicole Kidman, I think also caught people by surprise. You had Bruce Willis and Toni Collette, and then it was like, what's this weird thing with the kid that's going on here when it came to The Sixth Sense? But with this one just really being Nicole Kidman and focusing so heavily on her, we hadn't really seen a horror movie that was doing that for a little bit. That was so focused. I mean, Blair Witch does it in a different way, but it was so focused on just this one woman trying to protect her kids and unknown actors and actresses throughout who are now no longer unknown.
Yeah. And that's one of the joys of the horror genre and why there's a smattering of it throughout my top 100.
Yeah. Well, next week we don't have horror, right? Next week we're doing, but we are talking M. Night Shyamalan, which we talked about a little bit today because John's got Unbreakable as his number 78. The follow-up to The Sixth Sense, which people don't talk about nearly as kindly now, John. So I'm excited to see that one because I think Shyamalan's everything just fell apart once he started making dud after dud after dud for so long that now people don't look as positively on Unbreakable or The Village, which I actually think are two pretty good movies. The Visit, I didn't think was a very good movie, but that was one that got some credibility. But I'm excited to watch Unbreakable. I haven't seen Unbreakable in years, so that'll be good, and you'll get like a really authentic perspective on that one because I have not seen that in so long. The only thing I remember is Samuel Jackson going, "They used to call me Mr. Glass." That's the only part I remember. That's literally the only thing from the movie I remember. And then my number 78 is, what is my number 78?
The Revenant.
What is it?
The Revenant, which I've actually never seen.
Oh, perfect. And it's set in your homeland. So that's perfect.
I know. For someone who actually lived in the wilderness of Canada and had to deal with grizzly bears on a regular basis, it's surprising that I've never seen this. But that's because I was living in the wilderness of Canada when it was released.
There you go. Yeah, The Revenant. That will be a fun one to talk about. Next week will be a fun one to talk about because I think Unbreakable doesn't get the credit it deserves. And I think people just hate Iñárritu for some reason. Like they hate him for I don't know. I don't know if they hate his personality. I don't know what it is about him. But I remember when The Revenant came out, people were so upset that it looked like it was going to win awards, and then Spotlight beat it. And as we'll talk about when John gets to Spotlight, I couldn't disagree more. But we'll get there. We'll talk about that at a later time. But next week, The Revenant, I'm very excited to talk about that one. I have a lot to talk about with that. I've only seen it twice, and I haven't seen it since about 2016. So I'm excited to watch that one again. And Unbreakable. Those would be two good movies. Getting back into it over on Letterboxd now that my vacation's over. I'm kind of looking at more stuff, and so make sure to follow Pwood43 and Jay Millsip over on Letterboxd so that you can see what we're watching all the time. Top 100 lists. I just put out a list of like best movie from every year that I've seen a movie, which I thought was fun. That was something people were doing back on Reddit, like maybe 6-7 years ago. So I decided to just make mine public so that I don't forget. That was fun. No good movies came out in 1943, literally to the point that the best picture winner from 1943 didn't even come out in 1943. So I haven't seen any movies from 1943. But anyway, that's it. John, anything I missed? Anything that we need to touch on before we get out of here? Call this a night?
Nope. I think we're good.
All right, everybody. Thanks for listening. Thanks for sticking with us through all of this. That's episode number 22. Coming up with episode 23 next week, number 78 on our top 100 movies of all time. See you all then.